Welcome to the Igniting Change podcast. My name is Duncan Cook, founder of Three-Sided Cube, trusted technology partner for some world-changing organizations. We know the power that technology has to have a positive impact on people's lives. But on this podcast, myself and my co-hosts Puff and Sophie are out to meet the people behind the technology, hear their stories and understand what drives them, and hopefully inspire others to join the mission and do some good in the world.
Okay, right. Well, Mayleen, thank you so much for joining us. So for those of you listening at home today, we have a bit of a special one today. We have started our series on AI in disaster risk reduction. And my name is Sophia, also known as Puff, and I will be one of the hosts for this season. And I am very, very lucky to be speaking with Mayleen today. So Mayleen, did you want to introduce yourself? So tell us who you are and what organization you're with.
Sure thing. Thank you, Sophia. My name is Mayleen Cabral. I work with the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction as a partnerships officer here with the Americas and the Caribbean. One of my main roles is working with the Science and Technology Group. So it's composed of a variety of members such as NASA, NOAA, University of Mexico, etc. Just a big array of people and expertise, from government officials to big technological organizations, but also science and research. So here I am. This is how we connected through technology overall. So thank you for the invitation.
I love how you just drop those big names into the conversation. NASA, NOAA, you're lucky enough to be working with some incredible organizations.
Yeah, it is really interesting. And I've been learning so much from all the peoples and stakeholders that I really work with, because it's not only science and technology. I also work with parliamentarians. I work with the youth, which always keep me on my toes. And I'm able to collaborate with other UN agencies in disaster risk reduction, which is very different in many ways because every agency has their specialty and expertise, right? So.
Oh my gosh, I feel like there's some interesting bits there. Right, so, okay, I really, really would love to know whether or not you can share any specific examples where AI-driven solutions have significantly improved disaster response or mitigation efforts. Like, do you have any examples that you could share with us today?
Yes, I'm actually going to take a step back and talk a little bit more about disaster risk and how AI is a bit connected. So disaster risk reduction, we obviously see disaster risk and the elements and the reduction for disaster risk as different phases, right? That really compose disaster risk reduction. So we're talking about preparedness and mitigation approaches and strategies that need to be implemented. That the disaster occurs and we have to respond efficiently. And then there goes this long process of recovery work, right? That kind of overlaps with preparedness and mitigation strategies as well. So it's this, some people see it as a cycle, some others see it as like different components, but I always see it as overlapping because one actually has an influence in the other one. When we're talking about AI, which is basically simulation of human behavior, right? When we're talking about disaster risk reduction and AI truly helps us in being more efficient, more precise, in making sure that we have timely information for whenever we have to respond. But also, some examples are very specific when we're talking about preparedness and mitigation. For us to truly be able to respond effectively, that means that we have to be able to know what's happening underground, on the ground. So that means having risk assessments, and AI is very helpful in that element. And when we're talking about response, we can have geospatial data that can let us know where are those, those areas of impact, so we can actually provide those resources to those who have been impacted. And so it really is efficient. It helps us in being more, provide better decision making for those who have to be on the ground. And it really connects also the information between let's say policymakers that have to define what to do, right? But also those who are on the ground being able to support those who are being impacted. So yeah, it helps with data sharing. It helps with better understanding of data as well. But we also have to be very cautious.
Yeah, of course, and I'm sure we'll get into the risks and the challenges perhaps around
Yeah.
that. But it obviously is a huge, like it does feed throughout that cycle,
Yes.
doesn't it? Throughout all the different elements. I know they do overlap, but
Yeah.
I like the analogy of the
Yeah.
cycle. So it'll kind of like feed in
Hmm.
into each other.
Yes, they do. They do. And a lot of people do see it as one step at a time, right? Like we're now in recovery work, and that means that we have to do very specific. And it really helps us in identifying the resources that we need for that specific phase. And so it's important to recognize where you are in that specific cycle. So, yes.
And can you talk to us about specific examples in each of those phases? So you talked when you were talking about like the preparing, right?
Yes.
Talk to me about an example in that particular
So
phase.
we're talking about risk assessments, right? For risk assessments, right, in AI, that means that we're bringing in all of these variables and data. We're talking about the hazards, how do they function, right? So we're talking about earthquakes, how often do they happen, where exactly do they happen, what levels, right, of impact they can have. Then we're talking about exposure. How close are you from that possible hazard? And so, and then there's another element of vulnerabilities. And each one of them has a long list of variables that are being analyzed to be able to define a percentage of risk. And so, what AI does is help us. We plug in all the information, and then it just, I'm going to say it like this, but it spits out the information for us. And it tells us, like, this is what you should be considering, right? So the other thing about preparedness, it also can provide us with recommendations, right? There's when you're thinking about this long element of resilience, it can help us in identifying from a big compilation of resources what are the good practices of sustainable solutions for preparedness, for mitigation strategies. So those are examples of how AI can be very particular in supporting that specific phase. When we're talking about response, I mentioned it a little bit, but it's the geospatial, right? Satellite data. It really helps us in how can we bring down that information and that simplify and say, like, this is where you have to go. This is the area that has been impacted the most, or it gives us a level of impact, right? So we can define, okay, when we do, I don't know, a crisis analysis, right? Well, we need to go to this place first. Then we go here with the specific resources that it requires, right? Because maybe there's a group of people that, I don't know, the infrastructure fell. And so that means that the types of resources that they need is very specific versus a group of people who are marginalized and we can connect with them. So it varies. And what AI does is identify and help us be more precise in how we can identify those resources.
Amazing. And just going back to that, being prepared, the risk assessments.
Yeah.
There's like so much data,
Yes.
so much data. But interestingly, you were talking about, like the recommendations of what you could do,
Mhm.
but that's all based on historical
Yes.
data. Like it's based on models, right? So what's worked historically,
Yes.
but as we kind of move forward and that changes,
Mhm.
you're needing to feed those models and input
Yes.
new data because so much is changing at such a fast scale.
Mhm.
Like there are some real
Yes.
challenges around that, I imagine.
Yes.
And when I talk about it, I've spoken to so many people, and I know there's a lot of nervousness around data and the quality of the data and where the data's come from, like so that where the data's been sourced, and there's a lot of considerations there.
Definitely. And that's why I mentioned from the get go, like, this is great. AI is great. However, we need to be very cautious because AI will give us a result based on what we feed it, right? And we can see the world right now, right? It's a very complex world. And as I said before, AI is a simulation of human behavior, and humans are very complex. And so
Yeah.
we have to look at it and basically define, and I like to see it as question standards, right? We need to first understand what is the context of the data that is being put in, right? If you're defining specific, I don't know, solutions in the Americas, it's going to be very different to solutions in Europe. So the context is so important. The other element is who is providing that information, because sometimes we assume that the data really is representative of the whole society, but oftentimes it isn't, right? So sometimes we try to be positive and we think that we're being very humanistic in many ways, but it all depends on the data that is being collected, right? And so that means, are we considering able-bodied people and not able-bodied people? Are we thinking about the different religions? Are we talking about the different type of races? Are we talking about the whole component of society? And I think that's so important. And so one thing is experts that actually recognize the importance of AI and they understand how the systems and processes work, but also when we collect the information, who are we collecting the information from, right? And so I think that is one thing that we need to first evaluate before we actually understand the results, right, that comes from the AI. The other challenge is understanding the actual process of AI. And I think that, and many users nowadays, they're like, oh my gosh, this is so great. I use ChatGPT, I ask a question, and the information comes out. And I'm like, that's great. But do you know how that worked? Right? Like, where did they get that information from? How did they understand how to process that information? And I think that's so important, especially in disaster risk reduction, right? Because once again, context is so important. So I think those two big ideas needs to be um, evaluated and explored a bit more when it comes to disaster risk reduction. And I think we still don't know enough. I know that all the experts and the people who work in technology and AI, they can explain it very easily, but the users need to understand that process too. And I think that's where we need to start building our capacity building knowledge to be able to properly use AI and DRR.
And I think really we have, when we're designing and building solutions ourselves, we have two different approaches, right? We have the approach of we're building something to scale. So we're building something that we know, we know the parameters, we know it well, we're confident, and we understand how we're going to get that to scale. Right now, with AI, honestly, most of the solutions that certainly that we're building, we're designing and building, it's all around building to learn. Like, we are learning as we go. And I think that is a very different mindset for people to accept, get used to, and be comfortable with. We're we were some of the team earlier, well, this week they were playing about. There's now the GPT store, right? We were building some GPTs, if you like, and playing around and understanding how you put parameters and rails in place to really minimize jailbreaking of them and people taking advantage. And it is all around, we're all learning as we go and understanding what is possible. It begs the question of what what is right to move forward with, but we need to understand what's possible before we can actually start going down a more productive route of building to scale. Like, there's a lot of experimentation happening in this space right now, and I think you have to experiment to understand what you can
Yes,
push forward with.
yes, that element of exploration definitely is important. Um, And I think that's the other element of disaster risk, is this huge disaster risk reduction, particularly, right? It's this huge umbrella, and there's so many angles and so many different expertise that AI could not encompass everything all at the same time, right? And so we're talking about business resilience, community resilience, how it's being used. So that idea of learning is very important for sure.
So we've spoken about the first two phases. Well, depend. It's a cycle, right? So let's say
Yes.
preparedness, response. What about recovery? What about some examples in recovery?
Recovery work for that one, I was thinking more of the long resilience, right? We want to build back better. That means that you kind of break down and have this like predictive analysis of like, if I build a specific infrastructure in this specific way, will it actually be impacted the same way in the future, right? That's like an example. But this idea of long term, I want to make sure that when I build back better, when I establish better policies, right? I establish new strategies, people are more knowledgeable about these risks. That means that we have all that information, or we should. And so from that experience, right, now AI can be learning from that experience. And I think that goes in line with what you were mentioning. But particularly, it's that ongoing analysis of risk and making sure that we're providing, sustainable solutions that are always up and coming, and that it's what it requires, right? That update, continuous update. That's what also helps AI, right? Because it's always updating all the time. So it all depends on what you put in, which means that they will provide better solutions based on this new information. So yeah.
But you make a really good point there around is that continuous improvement. Like it's never done, okay? And I think that goes for everything, right? We could all be continuously improving everything that we do. I think what we have now is the ability to do that at quite a fast pace. And the speed has really, really picked
Oh
up.
yeah.
I've certainly felt it. I know our team have felt it recently, even just over the past few weeks. Like some of the stuff that's emerging, it's quite overwhelming. And we work in tech, you know, for those that don't work
Yes.
in tech or aren't, aren't in this on a daily basis, I can just imagine it just being very, very overwhelming.
Yes, and also it's because it's always evolving, right? I mean, if we look at technology of how it has evolved in the last, I don't know, 20 years, it's been exponential. And so
Yeah.
for people to actually keep up to date with that and not being in that field, right? The only thing that Nick probably know is like, oh, there's a new phone that uses this really cool new gadget. I don't understand it, but cool, right? But but that's like the element that I was mentioning before. It's we're still lacking the knowledge of really understanding what we're using, and
Mhm.
and I think that's what we need to kind of like catch up to. And how can we explain it to the masses of how things are really functioning, how the process really works, and that whole idea of really, we're really working at a speed that we can't even keep up with in some ways. Also happens with information. I feel like information just slips through people's hands, and sometimes it's not really understood or analyzed appropriately and then shared in a way. So I'm talking about fake news and, and misinformation. And that for me is also an element that we need to start to try to balance out. How can technology really facilitate the sharing of information and knowledge and understanding processes so people are actually understanding how things function? And in disaster risk reduction, that's so important, because for risks to reduce, there needs to be an increase of capacity. And that means knowledge, that means resources, that means collaboration, etc. So, yeah.
What I absolutely love is just the potential in this space. So I'm going to go back to when mobile phones kind of first came out, and I remember when the App Store first, like the Apple App Store, right? And one of the very and I was young, and one of the apps, I just remember it. It was very novel, like one of the first apps I ever downloaded, and it was like you drink a drink through your phone, like it just kind of, the volume went down on your screen, and it was just quite comical. Like, I look back now and there's not a real use case for that technology. Like, it was silly. But now I use apps on my phone for banking, looking after like the security of my house, or to engage with my kids'
Yeah.
teachers. I use apps every day. Like, they've become a very important
Mhm.
part of kind of like of my world. And I I look at how AI kind of has started to creep in. It's been around for a very long time, but actually it's really interesting to see it now seeping through, like some of the tools that I use every
Mhm.
day. We use a digital, like an online whiteboard, like to collaborate with the team. And there's a now as the past few weeks, there's a tool that I can just ask it to create me like a board, and it will just do it for me. Like, I
Mhm.
literally type in a command or talk a command, and it will just do it for me, which is amazing.
Yeah.
The benefit of that is it's saving me time, so I can then
Yeah.
use my time more efficiently in my
Exactly.
day. But what the importance of it in DRR is incredible, because actually we can help people work more efficiently,
Yeah.
we can crunch more data, we can analyze more data, which is an incredibly powerful tool, because
Yes.
ultimately what we're doing is going to be saving more people's lives. Okay,
Mhm.
we're trying to reduce the number of people that are impacted by disasters every single year, which is growing year on year. But the power, like the use case here is real,
Mhm.
and it's just so obvious and so
Yeah.
natural. It's I get very excited by it, but at the same time, some of the challenges that you've mentioned, quite concerning.
Yes. And honestly, I'm also very excited. I really understand the importance. Like, I'm a firefighter in the Dominican Republic, and timely response and information, it was life or death. Like, I needed to know if there was a specific hazard. And oftentimes, the way that we would do it was through, analyzing the area, recognizing the area, doing a quick risk assessment in like 10 minutes to be able to identify whether or not there's other hazards that we need to consider because there's a fire. And so, information at the right time is so crucial. It is in many cases life or death, right? And when we're talking about disasters, when we're talking about response, you can't take 2 weeks to analyze an event, because people are actually, being impacted in the moment by the disaster. So AI is absolutely crucial for that. It's an important part of our evolving and our part of resilience toward really having to reduce our risk to, environmental events, to also technological events. And the other thing about AI, I should have mentioned it before, but it also helps us think outside the box, right? What are those other risks that we're not considering? And one of them is those existential risks. Um, and so that also helps us out in like saying like, we are always thinking about the general, the ones that always happen, but what other things can occur? So it can help us kind of guide us that way, in some way or another.
Well, it's helping educate us,
Hmm.
really. And again, that's quite a bold statement, but if you're doing that risk assessment and you've thought of the main considerations, but actually there's a few other
Mhm.
prompts that could be given to you that could
Mhm.
save not only your life but other people's lives. So actually, it's really quite important. And
Mhm.
by prompting you, like giving you the right information at the right time, that serves an incredible purpose right there. And I think that nugget of serving the right information at the right time is super super important.
Important. And I think, and sorry I'm mentioning this a lot, but it's important to understand the process of AI, because that means that we can ask the right questions as well. Um, I'm a lot of my I used to work in the education sector, and a lot of my colleagues who are still in that field, we were talking about the AI and the changes that there can be, right? One of them is there's gonna be a lot of worry about the decrease of people's analytical skills, etc. But a lot of the teachers that I used to work with, they were like, but actually now I'm teaching my students how to ask the right questions, which is a big part of research as well, right? For me to actually understand what I'm looking for, that means I have to ask the right questions. And so that's the other element of AI, right? That we need to know what we're inputting, but also we know exactly what's going to come out, because we have an idea. We need to really understand that process. Those questions that we have to ask along the way. It's not a big question. Let me know when the next pandemic is going to happen. It's not going to give you that. But what are those type of risks based on previous pandemics that can happen in the future due to the current elements of vulnerabilities, right? So something along those lines can really give you an idea of what can happen in the future and start, in some ways, ideate those possible scenarios, which is another element of disaster risk reduction. That we need to be able to respond and prepare. We need to kind of understand what are those possible events that can happen in the future. So that's another thing that AI can really help us with, but we need to know how it works. So yeah.
And it's such an important point, and you apologize. Don't apologize. Like, it is an important point, and it's funny because this came up in a conversation I was having earlier today. People worried that our human skills are
Mhm.
going to deteriorate almost. I don't think they are. I think they're going to get stronger. I think they're
Okay.
going to get better because, like you alluded to, it can take away some of the manual processing tasks that maybe aren't important, but actually if it can be helping us ask the right
Mhm.
questions or allowing us to focus on more detailed
Mhm.
areas that need more I don't know, that need like a more of a human point of view or something, like it allows us to prioritize our time better. So I do think it can help aid us, but naturally there are a lot of risks and challenges
Yeah.
around that. But I love that point of, you know, asking the right questions and us evolving to ask better, stronger
Yeah.
questions, which is really, really
Yeah.
good.
And it's knowing the end, right? In some way or another. AI can give you those solutions, but you also have to have that end in mind to be able to do those questions, to ask those questions. So, yeah, I think that we have definitely challenges, but many opportunities. And I think that the challenges and recognizing those challenges, we can have greater opportunities because we can delve into those challenges, deal with the challenges, and reduce them. And so um, we do talk about, not only natural hazards, right, when we're talking about earthquakes, etc., but we also consider, because of the evolving technology, we need to consider like what are those possible risks that technology can bring, and security is one of them, right? Um, you mentioned it in your phone. A lot of your security measures are just there, and so it's considering like we do recognize that. So we are very dependent on technology now. Well, majority of the world in some way. So, what can we do to facilitate, enable our lives for it to reduce risks, but also we're not creating new ones? And that's like the other
Yeah.
element of disaster risk reduction, where we're not creating new ones. We don't want to create, we don't want new ones. We already have enough risks in this world. So, how can we make sure that we do use technology? And I love your motto, technology for good, in a way that we are making sure that we're reducing the risk without creating new ones. And so it's that enabling factor of facilitating us to truly reduce those risks.
And I think it's really important to say, sometimes technology can have like quite a bad reputation, and and don't get me wrong, it's to be honest, it's not the technology itself, it's the
Mhm.
people behind
Yeah.
it. It's bad actors, which you can't always eliminate, which is a thing, but there are so many applications of where technology is being used for good, and it is so powerful, and it has so much opportunity to save more lives or to impact lives more positively, i.e. minimize the risks that people are taking on a daily basis. Like that's a great use of technology, certainly in my eyes. But it's hard because it's ever changing. This landscape is not any. I mean, there've been some big milestones, I think, probably in my lifetime. The internet, the mobile phone, and now I'm looking at AI and just how quickly that's evolving. It's quite scary, and I don't think of myself as being too old, but it is like I just don't feel like I can keep up the pace.
Yes, I feel the exact same way. And the thing is, I'm starting to really deep dive into this world a little bit more, and I'm still more of the social sciences. How can we, use this as something that can really support us for disaster risk reduction, right? I'm not a tech person. It's important for me to say that. But I do see there are benefits. It really simplifies my life. It keeps me connected with people. It keeps me connected with the world, right? We saw that in COVID-19. We could continue majority, and I really want to state that, right? Majority of people were able to keep connected with the world. They could keep working, etc. Because of technology. Let's be honest, right? We need to give its credit. But I do feel that recognizing that I can't picture the next 5 years how technology will evolve or where it's going to go. It's always like this uncertainty of like, okay, I hope it continues going in a good way, right? It's being used in the proper way, and people, as you said, technology is created by humans, and humans, are not perfect. Therefore, technology is not perfect. But I think that with time, from learning and actually applying the lessons learned, it's important for us we will go in a positive path. And I really am hopeful, especially for disaster risk reduction. I think the need for us to understand technology in this realm, in this profession, and it is important. I think it really does make us more effective to be able to reduce risks.
So there's so many of us learning in this space right now. How important is the element of collaboration in this space?
So important. So important. One thing, and I mentioned it at the beginning, is that whatever you input, right, really has an effect of what the results are. And so it's not about just getting the information from example, like government will have vast amount of data, but that means also collaborating with the private sector that have information about insurance, and they do these levels of analysis of risk because they have to understand the insurance for people. It's also working with technology and researchers who understand the processes, and they have other data because of the research they've done. It's also working and collaborating with technological institutions that are collecting information, geospatial information, which is so important and crucial to really understand this world, right? And so you bring them all together, and you have a much more varied and a very, robust information that can give you so many ideas and angles about what the data can tell you. And it's not only that, it's also because I kind of like went very like top down, right? Like all these big institutions, it's also going local because the locals really understand whether that information is true or not, right? There's a lot of communities that are not connected with cities. And so they're oftentimes not included in data. And so that means that we need to be, going into the field, making sure that we're collecting that information, that they're part of the process of AI as well. Maybe not directly, but also getting their inputs of how this can be beneficial for them too. We're always very specific about technology and using technology, but who's the audience, right? And I go back to the AI. Who's the audience really understanding what they're using? So so yeah, collaboration is key. So that multi-sectorial, that varied group of people is important.
But I love the point that you made around, I guess, what I would call like real world validation. So, and we've seen it on some of the projects that we've worked on. So, World Resources Institute, they were using satellite
Yeah.
imagery very, 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 very quickly. But they were getting people on the ground to essentially validate what was being recorded and
Yeah.
trends that were being picked up. So, for example, where deforestation was happening, like they needed someone on the ground that was not
Mhm.
really connected to validate that that was happening, and that what we were seeing through the satellite images were telling the
Yeah.
story that we were just
Yeah.
assuming. And that real world validation is so
Important.
crucial whilst we're in this learning phase right now. I think that's a really important element. And I think too often it's very, and we're all guilty of it, we can all make assumptions from data or from like imagery that we
Hmm.
see. But in the world that we operate in right now, it's like, how do we know that this is real? Like, how do we know that this is actually happening? So having that validation piece is quite
So
important,
important.
and probably probably not done as often as it perhaps needs to
No,
happen.
I don't think it is. And we see that a lot also with like misinformation and fake news. People don't really do go back and try to understand whether this is true. Um, and I and that's a big problem, right? Especially when we're talking about problems that are outside of our understanding or outside of our context. We're very dependent on what's being given to us and not really deep dive and like, oh, actually, let me do a bit more research. I think there's another organization. It's Humanitarian OpenStreetMap. They do an amazing work and they collaborate with locals to be able to, understand um, the impacts at local level. And I think that is also an amazing thing to do because they are using technology, they are using AI, but they're also in the fields. And that I think that's a great combination.
I think it's one of the only ways in which it can work when you're crowdsourcing that
Mhm.
validation,
Yeah.
because for it to scale, for it to really, really work, you need input from a lot of people. The collaboration is massive, right? And it has to benefit all those involved. And
Mhm.
actually, that's a really lovely example that
Mhm.
you pull out there. And that's been going on for quite a few years, I
Yeah, I
think.
think one of the big examples, it's the one in Egypt. I can't be very specific, but I was talking with them, and they were giving me this beautiful example of how they had hundreds of collaborators just pulling in all the information in the map, so they can actually understand how to properly respond, or that sense of that recovery work that will be required. And yeah, I thought that was something that we need to continue to apply and work because they have volunteers and they have people that they directly work with. But what about if we work with different organizations that can provide more information, that can really support and have give them more, not them, but overall, right? Give more insight from different angles and yeah, approaches.
Right. So I'm going to, and this can be edited out, Maylene, so don't worry. Ollie, please forgive me. I'm doing this off the cuff. But there's a report that you're
Yes.
working on. Can you talk
Yeah.
about it? Can we share
Yeah.
about that? We can do yeah? Okay, that's cool. Tell me about this report,
No,
Maylene.
that sounds great. So as I mentioned before, I work with an amazing group of people. It's a regional scientific and technical advisory group. And for some years now, we've been talking about the importance of better integrating the element of technology. It hasn't been something that was truly highlighted in the work that we did. Um, but but it was so important to kind of do a deep dive to better understand that. What is technology for disaster risk reduction? And so one of the subgroups of the RSTAG was, well, let's do a report. And after a few workshops, lots of consultation processes, we now have around 100 people that are part of the mailing list to work on this special report that we want to understand better how technology is being used in the Americas and the Caribbean. How is technology not only being used, but how is it being effective? How can we learn from them? And what are those possible gaps that we can, as you said, we can keep learning and explore? And so right now we're going into a few topics. AI is one of them, so we can actually better understand how AI is working in the Americas and the Caribbean. And what I love about it is because of the region is so complex. It has a level of different levels of contextualization, right? Not only in terms of technology, but also languages and backgrounds, and it's amazing. I really am excited to explore this, and the way that it's being developed is in a very collaborative format. We didn't want just one person who just wrote the entire report. There's so many organizations and institutions that not only work in technology, others that work outside of the world of technology, but they do have a direct experience with technology and how they're implementing it at local level and at national level. So it's going to be an amazing way to explore this topic. So yeah, we're going to have this report hopefully being published in this year.
Yay! Fingers crossed. And we are very excited. We're going to be working with Mayleen and all of the other stakeholders on that report. Specifically, our focus is going to be all around the use of AI in this space. So that is super exciting. Right. So, last question. I guess, really, like in terms of resources, Mayleen, is there any shout outs that you want to give? Are there any resources that you want to direct people to that you found helpful yourself? And please don't worry if you don't. We don't have to kind of include this. But I think it's nice, as everyone is learning in this space right now, that we kind of share what tools or resources that we're using.
I can't say very specific ones, but right now we have a webpage. UNDR has a webpage, preventionweb.org, where you can actually explore some of those topics on technology, AI, that people have published all over the world. So it's not very specific to AI and technology, but it can give you a little bit of an idea of good practices or standards, guidelines, or even projects that are being implemented all over the world in regards to disaster risk reduction. So really invite you to go onto the website and learn a little bit more about it.
Amazing. Well, Mayleen, thank you so much for your time. Really, really appreciate it. And it's been an absolute pleasure. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you.